This video is sponsored by Audible. All right, now since this is a white oak cabinet, the first step is to mill up some white oak. These are 9-foot lengths of white oak, which were pretty much the max of my shop from end to end, so it was a little difficult moving materials around, but I got it, and once I found two pieces I liked the best, I glued these up. These will be the outer case, the top and the two sides. Got those out of the clamps and scraped off some of the glue, and then just started laying out for the top and the sides. Now these are going to be miter folded, so I'm using my track saw at a 45-degree angle to make those initial cuts. After that first one was done, a quick spinaroo, and then I could get the other side. Just take your time with this cut because you really want that joint to be perfect when that waterfall miter comes together. Now to cut the corresponding miter on the side pieces, I'm turning to my table saw and using what's called an L-fence. This is an indispensable table saw jig. I'll leave more information in the description below. This leaves a beautiful cut with virtually no burning, and you can also leave those guide blocks on there if you want to use them as clamping blocks later. Then I can cut the square end of it and start dominoing. Now I know a lot of people don't own a domino, but this was one of the reasons I invested in one. It makes aligning and clamping together these miters so much easier. The only thing out there that could probably beat it is the lamello joiner, which I'll introduce you to at some point. So with all my mortises cut, I could do a nice little dry fit and make sure things come together nicely. And then I could work on the center divider, gluing up 2 pieces of 1x8 white oak for that. And while that was drying, I cut up the pieces for the bottom of the cabinet and glued those up. Man, a lot of glue today. Ooh, squeeze. Now once the center divider was dry, I could glue on this additional strip on the front, and I'll show you why here in the drawing. Right there, rather than notch out the piece, I'm gluing on another one. It just makes for a much easier and ultimately cleaner joint. Now with my side pieces clamped and dry fitted in place, I could measure across the width of the cabinet for the bottom and then cut that with the track saw. And while I struggle mightily to reach my tripod, don't forget to subscribe, hit that notification bell, which will let you know when I release a new video so you don't miss it. Ah, got it. I need more Woolby camera jigs. Now when determining the width of the bottom, I'm taking into account 3/4 of an inch for the door, 1/8 of an inch for the setback of the push to open mechanism, and then I can measure from the back to the front, which gives me 14 strong. And I can rip that down on the table saw. And yet again, it was domino time. I'm using 8x50mm dominoes. Just remember to check your depth settings on your domino when doing this. Since I'm using a 50mm domino, that means it will plunge 25mm into each piece. Well, 25mm into that side piece would plunge it right through. So I make one cut at 25mm, the other at 15, and I trim my domino to 40mm in length. Next, I needed to cut the groove for the plywood back, and I always put a pencil line where that cut is going to go so I do not screw it up and put it on the opposite side. Oh yeah, that's happened. All right, to make my first groove in the side pieces, these have to be a stopped dado, because if it went all the way through, you would see that little notch on the bottom. So I'm using a 1/4 inch spiral upcut bit on the router with a stop block. And as you can see here, that produces a nice, tidy little groove. And then I have to square that joint up at the bottom so that the plywood will fit in there nicely. Now the grooves in the top and the bottom piece do not have to be stop dados, so I just did those on the table saw. It was much easier to manage those large pieces than on the smaller router table. And then with a little relative dimensioning, I could mark out the width of my center divider and cut that on the table saw. And if you remember from before, we used 3/4 of an inch for the door, 1/8 for the standoff of the push and open mechanism, 7/8, and that's what will rip that front strip to. And now we could get set up for plunging for the dominoes for that center divider, and then plunge our mortises into the bottom as well as the center divider. Again, depth settings are key on these dominoes, so just be very mindful of those when you make your plunge cuts in these. And to cut the final height of that center divider, I am turning back to the table saw in the L-fence again. This jig is an absolute game changer in my opinion. By using double stick tape to put on an auxiliary fence on your workpiece, you can basically cut to any line. And with that center divider squared up on the top, I could make all my mortises for those as well. And now here where and remember that thing about changing the depth setting? Well, oh boy, I did, and I accidentally plunged down, and Not to worry, here's how we're going to fix it. We're going to find a matching piece of grain, and since this was at an angle, it made it a little more difficult. But I'm going to use the domino machine itself to make a plug. So I plunge down deep, and then I cut around that on the bandsaw, shape it up on the spindle sander, and then slice a little bit off on the bandsaw using some double-sided tape. And since that cut the domino left was pretty ragged looking, I actually had to go in there and use the domino machine itself to make a nice clean hole for me to plug, which was pretty hairy because I had to get it in the exact same spot to make sure I didn't enlarge the hole and then my plug wouldn't fit. Once I was satisfied with the fit, get some glue, bang it home, and then flush it up. Now, there was really no way to get this patch perfect with this method because you had a cross-grain glue seam to contend with, but this is on the inside, underside of the cabinet. It will never be seen. But if I did this on a more visible part of the cabinet, like, say, the top, yeah, I'd have to rethink my strategy here. And if you want to see all my mistakes in the future and how I fix them, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. And now it was time for glue up stage 1, which entails gluing the sides to the bottom. And as you can see, I put some green tape on there just to catch any squeeze out, and totally neglected to put it on the end pieces for some reason. Don't ask why, because I don't really have a good answer. Luckily, I didn't really get much squeeze out. Utilizing some very long pipe clamps and some clamping squares, I was able to get that nice and tight and square. And then stage 2, which was the center divider. And again, forgot to put green tape on the actual divider itself, but I blame little Lola there for not reminding me. All right, scoot. Now on the bottom here, I'm actually just driving some screws that will be plugged later to make sure I get that nice clamping pressure in the middle. Now I could have used a caul and some clamps, but it would have been a little awkward, so I didn't. And while that was all drying, I ripped down the plywood for my back and then cut it to length on the chop saw. This cut doesn't have to be perfect because it will be housed in that dado we cut earlier. Okay, I didn't film it, but I did one final dry assembly of the cabinet with the back in place. So now I'll take it all apart, do any final sanding and glue squeeze out cleanup, and then prepare for the final glue up. And as promised, the final glue up. I like to glue the dominoes in one side first and get those set. That way I'm not fighting with both sides and getting glue on them. And then I could glue in the back. I kind of just tack that in place for right now until I get everything square, and then I can run more brad nails down that whole joint. Seeing these miter joints come together is a scary and satisfying moment all at the same time. These look nice. The clamps will pull those together. Lots of clamps. You can see I needed to put some couplings in the middle of my pipe clamps to make them longer. One final check for square, and we'll let that rest overnight. And while that glue dries, let's talk about the sponsor of today's video, Audible. Audible is the largest provider of spoken word entertainment all in one place. So if you don't have time to pick up a book because you're always on the go, or you're driving and you shouldn't pick up a book, but you can pop some earbuds in or Bluetooth to your car radio, Audible has the largest selection of audiobooks right at your fingertips, and it can all be accessed from a teeny tiny app right on your phone. I actually checked my Audible account today, and I've been listening since August of 2010. That's a lot of audiobooks. Now, I'm not a buff, but I do love history, and my catalog is full of historical audiobooks, anything by David McCullough or Stephen Ambrose. In fact, Stephen Ambrose's Undaunted Courage about Lewis and Clark is my favorite audiobook of all time. As an Audible member, you also have access to Audible's Plus catalog, which has select audiobooks, podcasts, Audible originals, even guided fitness programs and sleep tracks that are all free as part of your membership. To try Audible free for 30 days and get 1 free credit per month and full access to their Plus catalog, visit audible.com/Keith. That's audible.com/Keith or text Keith to 500-500. And with a good night's sleep under my belt, I could take this beast out of the clamps with a little help from Jerry. Or no help from Jerry, really. And since this cabinet will be hung on the wall and floating, I will be utilizing a French cleat system to hang it. So I get those cut, and I'm going to glue them to the back and use some pocket screws for clamping assistance. Once that glue dries, these will be strong like bull. And if you recall from before, when we drove screws through the bottom into the center divider, I'm going to plug those holes now using a plug cutter and some glue and a little whack-a-mole to drive them home. Then I'll flush them up and sand them smooth. And then only you, me, and anyone else you want to tell will know about it. Okay, now things get real serious, where we have to build the 4 doors that have continuous grain all the way across. Now, I spent a lot of time choosing these boards, orienting them, changing the grain, flipping them over, making sure they look the best. And then I cut them right in half, because I want to work in 2 smaller sections rather than in 1 large piece. It's just much easier for me to manage. So I got those in the clamps and let them bake overnight. And the next day, we could get to work on cutting them to size and fitting the doors. But first, a play session with little Lola. Okay, so there's many ways you can fit inset doors. Here's how I'm going to do it. I'm using 3 30-second spacers because that's the reveal I want around all sides, well, except for the bottom because that hangs freely. So I flush up one side and then I make a mark with a long 32nd inch spacer. And then it's back to the L fence. I use double-sided tape to tack on a sacrificial guide fence, run it through, and it's perfectly on my scribe line. Then I can bring it back to the case, and now I flush up the top and the right side, and I can get the left side marked and cut. And same process with the L fence again to get a perfect cut down my scribe line. Now you'll notice the top and the right side have my reveals on it, but the left side is cut exact to size. Part of that reveal is going to be created when I cut this door right down the middle and the full kerf of the saw blade takes out 1/8 of an inch of material. So with one panel now turned into 2 doors, I can fit those in place, slide in my spacers, and then finish up my final cut over here, which is barely anything off, about a 32nd of an inch. But the L fence helps me shave that off cleanly, and then back to the case for another little dry fit. All looks good, so now I can just draw a line along the bottom to flush up those. They were nice and straight, so I just took them to the joiner and just worked down to my... Oh my gosh. Okay, nobody move. Maybe she won't see us. Whew. Okay, to drill the holes for the hinges, I'm actually just using this simple Craig concealed hinge jig. I think this thing is fantastic. I know there are other better made jigs, but for the price and ease of use, you really can't beat this thing. And yes, that Forstner bit is included with the jig. I'll put a link in the description below if you want to check it out. So if you haven't seen these before, they're the Bloom Inserta hinges. So this hole right here is made large enough for this to fit in, and when you close this latch, that sleeve expands in the hole and keeps it tight. And a soft close. And to drill the holes in the cabinet itself for the mounting plates, I just made up this little jig that is ambidextrous and can be used in one way or the other on the left or the right side. Install some of my base plates, and then just do a quick check on the door, make sure it closes. Whew. Now typically on doors like this, you'd want to make them out of veneered plywood or veneered MDF and then edge band them. That will give you the most stable and flat doors possible. But the client on this build really wanted solid wood. So we're going to do what we can to make sure these remain flat and control the wood movement. This thing is going to want to expand and contract this way. So what we're hoping to do with the batten is keep it flat and make the door move the way we want it to move. So here's the joint in a nutshell. This would be the door. We have a dovetail keyway or socket, and then we have a batten with a dovetail on it. And that's going to slide in all the way nice and tight. It'll keep the door flat, but in order to control that wood movement, we're going to pin it at the top. That's going to be our static point, which will allow the wood to expand and contract downward from there. The reason I want to do that is because when these doors are closed, they have a certain reveal all the way around them. So if we just let this thing move up and down, this is going to get really narrow. It could get bigger. So let's get these doors off, uninstall the hinges, and then we'll head over to the table saw for the first step. So I ripped my battens to 1.5 inches wide. Ideally, you want this to be quarter sawn material because it will be the most stable. Once I joint them and get them plain flat and all to an equal thickness, I head to the router table where I'm using this Porter cable dovetail bit. Now I have to make 2 passes because I want a dovetail socket that's wider than the bit that I have. Ideally, you want to use 1 bit and make 1 pass and alleviate any other errors that could happen with making 2 passes. Also, it's important to note, since these are stopped dovetail keyways, I'm unable to get the other side done on the router table because my table isn't big enough to push my fence that far over. So I will have to bust out the handheld router to do the other side. Now with those cut, I need to move the fence that way to finish up the rest of the cut. If I move it the other way, it would create a climb cut. A climb cut on a router table can be extremely dangerous and scary and force you to run inside and change your shorts. More on that in a future video. Well, the climb cut, not the short changing. Okay, now we can cut our dovetail sockets on the other side of the door. So I'm using my depth setting here to set that to the same depth as I did on the router table. Now I admit I'm at a bit of an advantage here using this Festool guide rail and all the bells and whistles that go with it, but this would work equally as well if you clamp down a fence and just ran your router along it. And with the first pass done, I move the router over just a little bit and make my second pass. And because there was probably a little variation in the depth from the router table to the handheld router, I went and cleaned every socket up with the router plane just to make sure they were all at a consistent depth. And next it was on to the battens. And to alleviate some of the pressure on that router bit, I did some material removal ahead of time on the table saw. That way I would only have to just clean up those cuts to finish them off. So after a couple test pieces off camera, my fence and router bit were set up and I could run all of these through at the same time and on both sides. And there's your extreme close-up. Then I could square up those ends with a chisel and move on to even more detail work on these battens. I needed to trim off the first 3/4 of that dovetail. That way it would slide right in the socket and then overlap at the end. Use a little handsaw and a chisel to clean that up. And now things should become clearer on how this thing slides in. Bang. Oh, but wait, there's more. Where that batten would come into contact with the bottom of the case, that also needed to be removed from that dovetail. So I just found it easier to remove that on the table saw, and then clean it up with a chisel, and then test fit. And you can see at the bottom there, that will take into account it overlapping the case. Now the case is 3/4 of an inch. I actually set that back 7/8 just in case. And I also wanted to just ease the profile on these battens, so I did a chamfer bit all around and then cleaned up the end. Next, I needed to create some expansion slots for the screws I'm going to use to secure the battens to the door. I did this on the router table with a 1/4-inch spiral upcut bit and a stop block. I made my first pass on all of them, moved the stop block down, and then made a second slot on all the pieces. I also elongated the holes for my actual screw, not just the head, on the drill press. Now, before I assembled anything, I got a couple coats of shellac on the inside of those dovetail keyways just to seal up that end grain, and then I could start the assembly process. So, as I mentioned before, I'm just putting a little bit of glue at the top of the batten, and that will be the static point from which the wood movement should happen from downward on the door. I'm also putting a screw up at the top to act as a clamp while that glue is drying. Now this process I went over extensively with Philip Morley, who is an incredible furniture maker and teacher. I'm going to put a link above to his YouTube channel, so go check it out. So I really want to thank him for his help with this. So hopefully these doors remain flat, or I'll just blame him. Now these expansion slot screws are in there just tight enough to hold the batten down, but not to impede any wood movement. And with those finally done, we could get in a little playtime with Jerry. All right, maybe not. So I did plug those screws at the top so I could get those flushed up and sanded nice and smooth. And the last bit of construction was to make these little blocks to house the push-to-open mechanisms on the underside of the cabinet. I'm not pushing these all the way in because I'll never get them out. And then I could emblazon the back of the cabinet with my logo. And while I begin the arduous task of final sanding, I wanted to quickly mention that if you enjoy my videos and my content and you want to support what I do, you can head over to patreon.com/KeithJohnson Custom Woodworking and drop something in the tip jar if you're so inclined. I have some great reward tiers set up over there if you're interested in helping out. Otherwise, I'm just really appreciative that you love to watch my videos. And now it was time to start applying the finish. I'm using Rubio Monocoat Natural, which is an oil wax blend. I spread it around with a squeegee, use a white Scotch-Brite pad to rub it in, and then wipe off all the excess till it's dry to the touch. Then I hang these doors to dry, and then I can begin on the case. Just to give you a frame of reference on time, each door took me 15 to 20 minutes to do, and the case inside and out took a little over 2 hours. After the final buff, I let it sit for 7 days to reach its final cure, and then I could get the hardware back on in the doors and deliver this thing. And I'm going to let you in on a little bit of a secret here. I'm actually going to install this in my own home just to take the pictures. I find sometimes when I get to client's house that the lighting is bad or whatever the case may be, and I never end up with the pictures I want. So I'm going to get this thing assembled and hung up on the wall. Now, to attach the French cleat to the wall, I'm using these Fasten Master ledger locks. You can pick these up right at Home Depot. These have plenty of structural strength for holding up this cabinet. So with a quick lift and a drop, we are mounted, and no doubt much higher than it should be. I assume everybody keeps doors hanging in their closet to dry. All right, let's get these hinges snapped in and popped on. Oh yeah, soft close. And again. And one more for the finale. Please enjoy some final glamour shots of the cabinet. And be sure to like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, comment below, let me know what you think, and we'll see you on the next project.